Hello, my name is Sarah Tyson, Associate Professor of Philosophy at the University of Colorado, Denver. Today, Dr. Jeffrey Golub, Assistant Professor, Clinical Track, is going to interview me about how I'm thinking about the pandemic using the tools and methods of philosophy. Good morning, Jeff.
Good morning, Sarah. Nice to talk to you again.
Nice to talk with you again. So, 1 week later, and we're back together again, but this time you are going to interview me.
That's right. We have a bit of a turning of the tables here, but it's a round table, so we can be in the same positions relative to philosophy.
Perfect.
I really enjoyed speaking with you last week, but I think that before we begin speaking again, we should hear a little bit more about how you got into philosophy.
Sure, yeah. So I had a brother majoring in philosophy, which made me interested in philosophy, but it was like the last thing on earth I was going to major in, right? Because it's like I'm my own person. I'm not going to just follow in his footsteps. But it got me into a philosophy class, and it was rationalism and empiricism. And this was a class with Dr. Maria Bauer. And the thing I did not appreciate when I decided just to take a class was how much I was going to love it. I didn't anticipate that. And I think the thing I loved about it was I was so convinced by each person we read. So I was like reading Descartes and I was like, he's right. Like he's totally right. And then, we got to Hume. And I was like, no, Hume's right. How can they both be right? And it actually at the time felt kind of terrible because I was like, who's right? How do I decide? But I think what I fell in love with actually was sort of, it seems almost like a good argument seems almost magical because it's so convincing and it draws you in. And I remember I had to write a paper on Leibniz and I went to Maria's office and I was like, I don't have any critiques. And she just looked at me and was like, the whole thing is ridiculous. She was just like, how do you not have critiques of Leibniz? But I think so that sort of love of argumentation and just, somebody being able to put together their ideas in such a compelling way is what I fell in love with. And then I kept trying not to major in philosophy because it didn't change the fact that my brother was a philosophy major, but I just couldn't get away from it.
Yeah, that's lovely. There is something remarkable about being totally taken in by a thought, because of course these people thought these things as a unique phenomenon themselves, and to enter into that yourself and say, yeah, this is something that's pretty amazing.
Yeah. I mean, in a way, it's what I love about novels, right? That you get convinced by a world and drawn into it, and you sort of suspend questions that you might have about it. That was the thing that got me first about it, and that I think has kept me going, this just being able to see how other people see the world.
Yeah. Do you still rap with your brother about philosophy?
Sometimes. Yeah, sometimes. It's my brother has gone on to do other things, and so I'm around philosophers a lot, right? And that's part of the reason I wanted to do these interviews, is because I do miss that kind of ability to just sit down and talk with somebody to say, hey, what do you think about X? This gave me a way to do that, even as we're social distancing.
Yeah, it's been a remarkable experience having this window open for us, and I'm glad that you mentioned that, because you did create this interview series, and we've been able to hear our own voices with each other across these distances in this whole pandemic, and recapture a lot of our philosophical dialogue. So I think it'd be wonderful to hear what you've been thinking about during this time in particular.
Yeah, I think a lot in my own work. I think a lot about vulnerability and about how vulnerability gets organized socially. Um, and something I work on a lot are issues like child abuse or sexual assault. And I'm interested in those issues in particular because I'm also interested in how we respond to them as harms. And I think in the United States in 2020, we have particularly problematic ways of responding to those harms. Certainly the number one way that they get responded to is by silence and by people not being able to address them effectively. And then sort of the second line after silence and not being able to do much about them is we use the violence of the state to respond to them. And so I think about like in the 1980s, the United States decided to really take on child abuse as an important form of harm that we could organize around. We could organize responses around, and the way what the United States decided to invest in was child removal
Mm.
as the response to those forms of harm. And there's a certain sort of I understand why that seems like a good response, right? Because there's a way in which it's like, well, if somebody's harming a child, then the child should be taken away from that situation. What I think we have to think more about, and what I think a lot of community organizations like Communities Against Rape and Abuse in Seattle or Generation 5, which kind of grew up, as I understand it, in the Bay Area, but is a bigger organization than that now. What they ask are, how do these harms happen, right? Like, how do they come to exist in these social conditions? And so what can we do to change what structures people's lives, what structures their vulnerability, right? Like, why should childhood be a time of harm? It's certainly a time of dependency and of certain forms of vulnerability. But why then are there these harms that we can predict in the lives of so many children? And I think, in the time of this pandemic, this is becoming clear in a new way to a lot of people about how vulnerability gets organized, right? That we're asking people to be heroic when they do essential services. Now, they're certainly doing something vital. Like people who stocked grocery store shelves were always doing something vital, something we all depended on. So why do they now have to be heroic in doing something so vital and valuable, right? Like, how are we all organized such that we have to ask them to be heroic at this time? Why is heroism called for? Why not have all the PPE they need, right? Why not have hazard pay? Why not have a living wage? Why not have organization of childcare for people who are doing these totally essential services for us? Why aren't things that way? And I think this is where my questions always go, is not how can we hold individuals accountable or focus in on individuals as the wellspring of problems, but how can we look at ourselves as the organizers of life together and how we might be able to do that differently to address these problems, right? How could we make it so that children don't get harmed in their homes, not by criminalizing their parents, criminalizing people who have been put into positions. I think about this a lot now. Like, we see domestic violence rates going up. We see harm against children going up. We see child pornography expanding during the pandemic. And I understand the worldview that says it's because there are bad people who do these things to children. I understand that worldview. I just don't think it's the right explanation. I think it doesn't go far enough to ask why and what capacitates some people to not do that under these conditions, right? And how could we capacitate people to not exploit each other's vulnerability? And the more research I do on this, the more I see that trying to exploit people's vulnerability as a response to exploiting vulnerability doesn't work. So in other words, taking people out of a situation and putting them into a prison or a jail where their vulnerability is going to be exploited doesn't answer the harm that we're accusing them of, right? And it doesn't fix the situation in which those harms occur.
Yeah, that's fantastic. I think the way you recast a lot of these concepts of dependency somehow being reformulated into vulnerability, and why that has to go in that direction. It's odd that these kinds of institutions that we have become so evident in a situation like this, but in a way, the situation itself is only accidental. It's the institutions were always there in the first place.
Yeah, I mean, they're certainly contingent, right? We could change them. But we need to be able to think differently about them. If you think, well, that person lost their job, and so of course they're going to become homeless, and that's what they deserve, right? That's a very different. Another question we could ask is, why does loss of job result in loss of housing
Hmm.
or healthcare or social connections, right? Like, what if we organize things differently so that when somebody lost their job, that was the moment at which we had these institutions, these social structures in place to carry people over that time, right? To
Hmm.
like give them what they needed. This is what I think is happening. I see oil field workers, right? The oil prices have gone sometimes into negative territory. And what's hard about this is that's on a sort of climate change front. This is good news,
Right.
that people aren't demanding oil. Um, but for the oil workers, right, like this is devastating. And
Hmm.
how are they going to make it to the next month? And how are they going to keep their homes? How are they going to feed their children? How are they going to take care of their families? And I think those are the questions. Why should it be the case that they are left vulnerable to those kinds of questions at this moment? What we need to do is stop using fossil fuels. And we have a moment of transition where we could make that possible. But what we can't do, I think, is have that happen on the backs of the workers, right? We need to organize to protect those people and to help them through this transition and to help everybody through this transition. And I think we're imminently capable of this. And the question for me as a philosopher is, how do we need to think differently? What kinds of questions do we need to ask such that these crises, these moments of transition, can actually um, be used in ways that bring us together and that strengthen our social ties, that strengthen how we work together, rather than individualizing us and then leaving us to, in some cases, this is happening in your city, right? Having to shelter in a subway car to try to not die.
Right. Yeah, there's a imminent opportunity in the meat industry for the same reason, right? An opportunity
Yeah.
for transition.
Yep. And this is what I see everywhere. And I'm not, um, there are these views that are sort of accelerationist, like we have all these problems and what's happening now is sort of an acceleration of them. And this is a good thing. Like for me, I'm always interested in, um, nobody to me is expendable. Nobody should be voted off the island. Nobody should be eliminated.
Mm.
And and we're at this point of transition where the way that it was working before, it was not working for a lot of people before, but there was a sort of cover or it was sort of working poorly, but well enough that a lot of us didn't have to confront it in our day-to-day lives. And now we're having, I think, en masse to confront these vulnerabilities and these harms much more starkly in our everyday lives. And so it's, like I wish in many ways this weren't happening. It is happening. And so how do we make sure that we take care of everybody? And we can do this, like I think as humans are so creative and we can do this, but we need to be able to think. We need to have those sort of questions in mind and those ways of thinking in mind. We need to be capable of thinking in those ways and capacitated. And so I look at sort of the structures that take us away from that take us away from those capacities, and that tell us that we can't do it, or that
Mm.
it's not the right thing, right? This whole framing, it's either lives or the economy,
Mm. Yeah.
right? Like that's a very bizarre framing.
Yeah.
But it's got a long history. And the structures that uphold that kind of framing are deep, and we're entangled in them in all sorts of ways. And so to start prying those apart and to pick away at that and say, whatever got us to this point is unacceptable. Whatever got us to that framing is unacceptable. So how do we pull away all those reasons? How do we pull away all those arguments? How do we pull away all those structures so that we can look at this differently and see that the choice between lives or economy is a false one?
Yeah. Yeah, it's so bizarre to see that kind of stiff upper lip response, like, well, I'll die for the economy. It's just the right thing to do. Like, where did we get to that point?
Yeah, and I think we can trace it, right? I think we
Yeah.
can give a history to it, and that's our work as philosophers, is to understand how we came to think that that was true.
Yeah, this is why I think is so insightful about the way you've articulated this as an organization of harm. Because I thought, especially in what you just said in your previous response there, that in a way the organization is almost a deferral. So it's that we explicitly don't know what to do about these kinds of problems. So we simply create a kind of system that puts those issues off and makes them something
Yeah.
that can be sort of indefinitely ignored. Because I wanted to ask you, I mean, that the organization itself, if we think of it from a structural point of view, is it's not so much. I wonder what you think. Is it the problem that we try to organize no matter what we do, or that this is the wrong kind of organization?
This is the wrong kind of organization because the deferral happens through the exposure of some people to premature death.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like, this is the thing about using, for instance, prisons as a response to harm, is that I think how most people imagine that is somebody's done something illegal, criminal, and so they get removed from society, problem solved.
Right.
And what I think we're having to confront now is, right, like, that when people are put in prisons, they're not removed from society. They're located in a different place. And they're located in a place where basic things like access to soap and to the possibility of organizing social life in a way to save yourself in the midst of a pandemic becomes impossible,
Right.
right? These are places of immense violence and degradation, and they have been for a long time. And that's been widely palatable for a long time, I think, has a history. And I think in the United States, it has a highly racialized history. And so there are populations that get targeted for premature death. This is Ruth Wilson Gilmore's definition of racism, right? Is this targeting of a population for premature death. And that this kind of targeting for premature death, this is a way of deferring the problem for some people, but not for the people targeted.
Mm.
Right? And so that kind of ability to say, oh, when people are in prison, they're out of social relationships, the problem is resolved, we don't have that source of harm, is false. Right? Those people have been located elsewhere. And those locations become sort of sites of a certain epistemic opacity, or it's not even that they're opaque to us, right? We think we know what happens in prisons because we're constantly consuming images of it through movies and television. This is Angela Davis, talks a lot about how prisons and incarceration generally get represented to us, and that becomes like a form of knowledge that we think we have about them. And what's happening now when we're looking at somewhere like at Rikers Island, for instance, a place of intense degradation and lack of basic needs, right? We're watching people die on the scale of hours and days instead of over weeks and months. And there's something about that is more immediate. And so it's not that Rikers wasn't always a place in which massive harm was happening. It's that now it's much clearer in a widespread way. And we don't have to organize our lives that way. That doesn't have to be how we do it. But we do have to look at how it got there, how we got to Rikers, right? How we got to over 2 million people being in places where they can't reliably wash their hands.
Yeah, it's extraordinary. Um, the um, the response to this, I was wondering if you could say in short, what you think might be a kind of a position we can take in this situation now.
Yeah, I mean, I think that prison abolitionists are doing this, and people are just getting people out of jails and prisons in extraordinary ways. And because they've been organized for decades to do this, they were ready. And they've been doing it. They've been getting people out of detention centers. They've been getting people out of jails. They've been getting people out of prisons. And I think, right, looking at this work largely done by activists of color to to address these issues through decarceration, through decriminalization, through rethinking what we do in the face of harm. What's really effective in preventing child abuse is not to be ready to punish people once a situation is developing in their home. What's really effective is if people have access to food, if they have access to safe shelter, if they have access to structures of support like daycare, and if they have access to things like classes, to being able to continue their own education and growth as a person. Supply those things, child abuse goes away, right? Capacitate people, capacitate communities. And so I think this is what grassroots activists have been doing for a very long time, and they're doing it very effectively. I think we can scale that up. But I think this commitment that we've had to eliminating people we see as a problem has got to stop, right? It's this investment in elimination. We've got to think about where that comes from, and we've got to think about why do we see elimination as the answer, and what do we do that isn't eliminatory, right? Like, how do we solve problems in our own lives in ways that don't eliminate people, right? If you've ever worked through a conflict with a friend, then you've seen the potential for a different world, like you don't always just cut somebody off when you have a conflict or a problem with them. How do we spend more time? This is the philosopher Alyssa Bierria talks about this. How do we take ourselves seriously as the creative problem solvers that we are, and look at the practices in our own lives that we can expand?
There it is. That's the perfect gateway to part 2 of our conversation. I'm sure of it.
When we pick this up another time.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for asking me these questions and letting me talk at length about them.
Sarah, that was incredible. Thank you so much for letting me talk to you.
Yeah. Thanks, Jeff.